They didn't expect you to stop responding. They expected a version of they had memorized. The version that always gave them a second chance, even when they hadn't earned the first. They expected overthinking, doubt, and the kind of vulnerability that bends into apology. What they didn't plan for was the version of you who stopped negotiating your worth. The version who paused and asked, "Wait, why am I the only one adjusting?" That moment of pause was your power move. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even loud. It was simple. And because it was simple, it was devastating. People who build strategies around your insecurity can't survive your self-awareness. You didn't leave in a storm. You left in clarity. And that's what made it permanent. You weren't playing a game, but they were. You were building connection. They were building leverage. You were transparent. They were strategic. And that imbalance felt normal for a long time because you were conditioned to think effort was love. You thought emotional labor made you valuable. But then something inside you snapped. Not in rage, but in realization. You saw the loop. The moment they praised you just enough to pull you back in, only to revert to neglect once you softened. And instead of trying harder, this time you leaned back. You let the silence say what you were done repeating. That was the move they couldn't handle, because it showed you finally understood. Love isn't proven by staying. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave, and let the pattern die with your absence. You didn't become cold. You became precise, and that terrified them, because precision is hard to manipulate. When someone who once craved your validation no longer reacts to your silence, they lose their grip, not because they lost you, but because they can't reach who you became. That's what this entire shift was about. Who you became. It wasn't revenge. It was release. You started asking better questions, questions that had nothing to do with, what do they want from me? And everything to do with, what am I building for myself? That shift removed you from their orbit, not as punishment, but as preservation. And when you became someone they couldn't predict, they called you distant. In reality, you were just no longer available for the dynamic that once drained you. Here's the truth. They thought they knew your limits, and for a while, so did you. That's what made the move so powerful. It didn't just surprise them. It surprised you. You had no idea you were capable of walking away without closure, of not sending the final message, of not needing the last word. That kind of self-restraint doesn't come from ego. It comes from healing. It comes from finally realizing that peace isn't found in proving your side. It's found in protecting your energy from anyone who makes your worth feel conditional. That's not detachment. That's growth. And growth looks quiet on the outside, but inside, it feels like a revolution. They had the advantage as long as you were unsure, as long as you still believed it could be fixed if you just said it the right way, as long as you still saw their potential louder than their patterns. But the moment you stopped confusing consistency with chemistry, everything shifted. You saw the truth. And more importantly, you accepted it. That's what people forget. Healing doesn't always look like a new relationship or a better job. Sometimes healing is in the moment you stop chasing the person who keeps letting go. That was your one move. And it wasn't personal. It was necessary, not to hurt them, but to finally stop hurting yourself. You used to think loyalty meant holding on. Now you know it means knowing when to let go. That's what they didn't account for. They expected you to be loyal to them. They never expected you to be loyal to your own growth. But growth comes with distance, and distance comes with insight. From far away, you could finally see what the closeness was costing you. It was costing your confidence, your peace. And when you saw that clearly, you didn't need a dramatic exit. You needed boundaries. That's what real self-respect looks like. Not fire, not fury. Just knowing you deserve a connection that doesn't exhaust you. You thought you needed them to validate your value. But what you really needed was space to rediscover it on your own. And that's what your move created: space. Space to breathe without guilt. To think without being gaslit. To feel without walking on eggshells. That's what made it so powerful. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a reclamation. You took back the parts of you that kept shrinking to keep them comfortable. You started honoring the voice inside you that said, "This is not enough." And instead of silencing that voice, you followed it. That's what broke their control. Not defiance, not deflection, but the quiet act of choosing yourself. It's funny how often they label it a betrayal when you stop betraying yourself. How they call it disloyalty when you finally become loyal to your peace. That's what happens when someone benefits from your confusion. They'll always call your clarity a threat. But that clarity saved you. It taught you that being hard to love usually just means being unwilling to settle. That being too much often means having needs they're unwilling to meet. You didn't change who you were. You changed what you'd tolerate. That distinction is everything. And once you learned it, there was no going back. Now they say you switched up, that you turned cold, that you forgot what you had. But what they really mean is, you stopped shrinking for me. What they really mean is you became immune to the games. And they can't say that out loud because it would require accountability. So they rewrite the story to make themselves the victim. Let them. You no longer need their version of the truth to be okay with your decision. You've seen too much, felt too much, learned too much to go back. You made the move that broke the cycle. And that move wasn't cruel. It was the most honest thing you've ever done. Because in the end, your growth wasn't loud. It was complete. The people who once had power over you now sit in confusion, wondering why nothing they say works anymore. And you've built peace around your name. You've stopped asking, "What did I do wrong?" and started asking, "What kind of life do I want to build from here?" That shift, that one internal pivot, was the move that changed everything. Their plan depended on your uncertainty. But your future, it belongs to your clarity. Most people don't recognize healing because they expect it to look like happiness. You weren't smiling all the time. You weren't announcing breakthroughs on social media. You were pulling yourself out of mental corners you hadn't named yet. You were sitting through discomfort without numbing it. You were learning to validate yourself in silence. That's what real healing is: unglamorous, confronting, deeply private. And when people saw you go quiet, they assumed something was wrong. But you were finally doing something right. You were unlearning everything that taught you to betray yourself in order to keep others comfortable. That kind of work doesn't make noise. It makes changes. They ripple through every room you enter now, whether you say a word or not. There came a day when you stopped taking everything personally, not because you stopped caring, but because you started seeing clearly. You realized their mood wasn't about you. Their projections weren't your responsibility. Their silence didn't always mean punishment. You started decoding reality through your own lens instead of the survival lens you were handed as a child. That's when the healing deepened. You stopped assuming every distance was a rejection. You stopped performing empathy for people who weaponized your softness. And slowly, quietly, you became emotionally fluent. No longer reacting, just responding. That frightened the people who only knew how to connect through your confusion. But you didn't owe them access just because they were there when you were still learning how to breathe. Nothing shifts your life like realizing that peace is something you build, not something you wait for. You were tired of chasing moments that felt like relief but left you empty afterward. The late-night texts, the breadcrumb apologies, the high highs that always dropped you back into doubt. You wanted steadiness, not stimulation. And once you realized that, you stopped letting chaos back in just because it looked like passion. Healing taught you that boring is often just safe. That silence doesn't always mean loneliness. That someone who brings peace is infinitely more valuable than someone who gives butterflies. And the people who once gave you adrenaline now just feel like noise. There's a certain kind of grief that comes with growing. Not because you miss who you were, but because you see how much of your life was built around being misunderstood. You mourned the years you spent explaining your worth, the friends you lost when you stopped being the easy one, the relationships that couldn't survive your boundaries. But grief isn't failure, it's transition. You were allowed to feel the ache of letting go, even if what you let go of was never good for you. Healing didn't mean you stopped feeling. It meant you finally started honoring those feelings without judgment. And once you did, everything changed. You stopped needing to be okay all the time. You just started being real. People underestimated you because you looked peaceful. They didn't realize how much war you had to survive just to sit quietly in a room and not be triggered. They didn't know about the nights you replayed every word, every look, every moment where you said, yes, when you wanted to scream, no. They couldn't see how much strength it took to walk away from patterns that used to feel like home. But you knew, and that self-recognition, that unshakable self-witnessing, is what separated the old you from the one who's rising now. You didn't need applause. You needed alignment. You weren't interested in validation. You were chasing inner stillness. And the people who once saw you as too emotional now call you intimidating. Because peace, once earned, feels like power. Choosing yourself wasn't loud. It was subtle. It happened in moments when no one was watching. When you said, "I'm not explaining this again." When you didn't return the call. When you stopped overthinking that pause in the conversation. When you ordered dinner alone and felt whole. That's what they missed. They thought healing would be some grand transformation. But the truth is, it happened in 100 quiet choices you made every day. Choices that didn't need to be justified. Choices that rewired your nervous system and rebuilt your sense of identity. You didn't tell people you were growing. You just stopped letting them shrink you. For the first time, you saw how much of your energy was going to people who didn't value it, not because they were cruel, but because you didn't set a cost. You gave without pause, offered patience without end. But healing taught you economics. Emotional economics. You learned that attention is currency, that access is sacred, that you are not obligated to keep anyone emotionally rich while you're going broke. So you adjusted the budget, you tightened the circle, you began investing in reciprocity, and the returns, clarity, capacity, calm. The people who had you on overdraft started to notice your withdrawal. But you weren't empty. You were finally balanced. They didn't understand how someone so forgiving could become so firm. That's the paradox of healing. It softens your heart but strengthens your spine. You didn't lose your compassion. You just directed it inward. You used to see red flags as cries for help. Now you see them as invitations to leave. That's growth, that's maturity, that's healing in motion. You no longer confuse someone's potential with their pattern. You don't need to see the good in everyone. You need to see the truth in them and respond accordingly. That wisdom came from pain. From all the times you stayed and got burned, you didn't become bitter, you became aware. Not everything deserved your response. That was the lesson you struggled with most. You used to think silence meant weakness, that walking away was avoidance. But now you understand that real strength is in restraint. You don't know every insult an answer, every lie a correction, every loss a war. Some things are beneath your healed self, and that realization doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you clear. Clear on your values, clear on your boundaries, clear on what you're no longer willing to entertain. And in that clarity, your energy returned, not as fire, but as focus. Healing wasn't about fixing yourself. It was about remembering who you were before you were taught to apologize for your needs. Before the people you loved convinced you that your sensitivity was a problem. Before you learned to smile through betrayal just to keep the peace. You didn't need to become someone new. You needed to come home to yourself. And that journey, messy, quiet, sacred, is the reason why you now move differently. It's why you don't explain your distance. Why you don't chase connection. Why you don't rush your process. Because you finally know you're not hard to love. You're just no longer willing to shrink for it. You stopped seeing healing as a finish line and started treating it like a lifestyle. There wasn't a day where you suddenly arrived, fully whole, pain-free, untouched by triggers. That was the fantasy they sold you. What really happened was different. You woke up one morning and noticed that your first thought wasn't about them. You had a conversation and didn't spend the next 3 hours analyzing every word. You looked in the mirror and for once, didn't tear yourself apart. That was healing. Not a victory parade, but a shift. A subtle one. The kind you barely notice until you realize a week has passed and your peace wasn't disturbed by someone else's inability to meet you where you are. You became consistent. Not perfect, not always confident, but consistent in how you returned to yourself when you drifted. And that consistency is the quiet superpower that no one applauds, but everyone feels when they're near you. You weren't healing to be liked. You were healing to be free. Free from guilt that wasn't yours. Free from relationships that made you doubt your own reality. Free from the pressure to stay agreeable while your needs went unmet. That freedom wasn't always pretty. It cost you connections. It exposed patterns. It forced you to admit things you spent years denying. But freedom is never comfortable in the beginning. It's lonely. It's awkward. It's full of moments where you ask, is it me? And the answer isolates yes, it's you. You're the one who changed. You're the one who stopped settling. You're the one who finally said, this version of me can't keep pretending.